Brad Pitt just started drinking again after years of being sober and routinely attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. The news has gone viral in the past couple of weeks since he sat down for an interview, offered the journalist a glass of wine, and told America he is now off the wagon. And then he joked that he can have a glass of wine. Well, he can actually have a few. He even said he got overconfident a couple of times and then went, nope, it's not good for me. So I think it raised a question that a lot of people across America are asking. If a person once drank dangerously, can they ever drink safely again? By the end of this video, you'll understand several fascinating things about what's actually happening here, both to Brad Pitt and to alcohol in America, better than anyone that's arguing about it online. I'm going to tell you why Brad quit in the first place after his divorce from Angelina Jolie, and the one thing he said about those AA meetings that many people find surprising. You'll learn about the friend who talked him into getting sober, a friend who's still sober today, over a decade later, and what actually separates those two outcomes, because it isn't just willpower. And you'll learn why drinking alcohol across America just hit a 90-year low, with one reversal that nobody saw coming. Young adults now drink less than people over the age of 35, which has never been true before in the history of the survey. Along the way, I'll tell you about a researcher who was accused of fraud for suggesting that any of this was even possible, and about a treatable condition that families mistake for Alzheimer's disease every single day. If you or someone you love has ever said the words, "I think I can just handle just one," please send them this before they find out the hard way. I'm Neil K. Shah, a Johns Hopkins and NIH-funded caregiving researcher and the CEO of Carryaya. I've helped thousands of families navigate aging, dementia, and serious illness. I'm not a clinician, but a leading researcher and innovator in caregiving, and I want to be careful here because this subject hurts people when it's handled badly. So 2 promises here before we start. 1, this is not a video telling anyone in recovery to test moderate drinking. And it's not a video shaming anyone who chose abstinence and never looked back. So here's what happened to Brad Pitt and why it's gone totally viral in the news. In an Esquire story published August 10th, the writer sat down with Brad, who offered him wine. The writer wondered whether the wine was only for guests, and Brad laughed a little and said no, he'd been sober for 7 years, and then he got back off the wagon. Then he held up a finger to make sure the next part, landed home, in a more restrained manner. He said he'd gotten overconfident a couple of times, caught it, and pulled back. He said he can have a few glasses, but not a lot. His words were, "I have to be professional about it." Everyone watching had one of 2 reactions to that. Some of you felt relief, some of you felt a drop in your stomach because you've watched someone you love say almost exactly those words, and then you know how it ended, and it ended badly often. I think both reactions are backed by evidence, and that's really the strange part. So let me give you, my view up front. Can an alcoholic ever drink safely again? I think that's the wrong question. It's 2 completely different questions under kind of the same cover. Question 1 is about control. Can this person drink without losing control of it? And question 2, importantly, is about health. Even if they never lose control for a single day, what is the alcohol itself doing to their body? And those questions, I think, have totally different answers. And almost every fight you've seen about this happens because sometimes 2 people are arguing the different questions and end up arguing with each other. So let's talk about both. First, control, including a change the US government made recently in 2022 that very few people have noticed. And second, health, and why the rules changed dramatically after age 60, especially relevant as Brad is now 62. Third, what's happening to the whole country, which is even stranger than the headline suggests. Now, to understand what Brad is doing, you need to know first what he was doing before. In 2012, Pitt told an interviewer, and to quote him, "I could drink a Russian under the table with his own vodka. I was a professional, I was good." He talked about using substances, in his word, pacifiers, things that he was used to run from feelings. Then in 2016, Angelina Jolie filed for divorce after 12 years together and 6 children. And in a GQ interview the following year, Pitt said he'd been boozing too much. He said he couldn't remember a day since he left college when he wasn't drinking or smoking something. He was 6 months sober at that point, and he described it as bittersweet. And he said something profound, that he had his feelings in his fingertips again. He spent about 1.5 years in an all-male AA group, and what people find surprising here is the thing he singled out wasn't the steps or the sobriety chips. He said it was the honesty. He told the New York Times that he had all these men sitting around being open in a way that he'd never heard. in a room that had no judgment because there was little judgment of each other, so there was very little judgment of yourself. Think about that because I think it's going to matter enormously as we go through this video. What he described as the active ingredient here wasn't just the abstinence itself, but the room of others helping. Then in 2020, while accepting an award, Pitt publicly thanked Bradley Cooper for helping him get sober. Cooper quit drinking around age 29 and has said he did it because he realized it was going to ruin his life, and it scared him. Bradley Cooper is still sober today, more than a decade later. So you have two famous men in the same industry, same friend circle. One helped the other get sober. One is still sober, and the other one is drinking again at age 62. What separates those outcomes? Many people would say it's willpower or character, or just how badly you want it. I think that's largely wrong, and the research is unusually clear about it. What separates them is something measurable, something neither man chose, and something that very few people talk about. It's severity. And once you understand this, I think the entire debate reorganizes itself. I'll come back to Bradley Cooper, but first the numbers. And here's the takeaway on control. Some people do drink again without losing control, and they are overwhelmingly the same people whose problem was mildest to begin with. The biggest survey of American drinking is a federal study called NESARC, N-E-S-A-R-C. Researchers interviewed more than 4,000 adults who had previously met the criteria for alcohol dependence and asked where they'd landed years later. 5 groups, about a quarter were still dependent, about a quarter had partly improved, about 12% were drinking at risky levels without symptoms, about 18% were completely abstinent, and about 18% were drinking at low levels with no symptoms of dependence at all. Researchers call that non-abstinent recovery. It's real, it's been reproduced, and follow-up work from a major treatment trial called Project Match found some people sustaining that pattern with good functioning several years later. So this idea of drinking moderately after being an alcoholic isn't just a myth invented by people looking for permission. Which brings me to the thing that the government recently did. In 2022, the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, the federal agency that funds this entire field, wrote an official definition of recovery. And for the first time, that definition did not require abstinence. It required that the symptoms of the disorder go away and that the heavy drinking stop. So think about that. Under the US government's own research definition, a person can be in recovery and still drink. That's an enormous shift, and it happened without almost any public attention. For most of the last century, American recovery culture ran on one rule: cross the line once and you never cross back. The agency that funds the science now says that picture is much more complex. But hold on, because the follow-up study complicates the complication. In 2025, a team led by John Kelly tested that new definition against about 500 real people over a full year. About 35% hit the recovery threshold. Of those, roughly 2/3 were abstinent, and about 1/3 were moderating. So far, that sounds like a win for moderation. But there was a major twist. The abstainers had steadier, more stable recoveries and much better overall functioning. And the people who successfully moderated had started out with fewer and milder symptoms in the first place. So, moderation didn't make them milder. Being milder in the first place made moderation possible for them. In 2013, psychiatry changed how this even gets classified. The old either-or framework, that's alcohol abuse versus alcohol dependence, became one condition called alcohol use disorder, measured on a sliding scale from mild to moderate to severe based on how many of 11 symptoms a person has. That matters more than it sounds. 2 people can both truthfully say, I had a drinking problem, and yet be in completely different situations. Someone who hit 2 of those 11 criteria during a terrible year, and someone who hit 9, had physical withdrawal and lost control over and over, are technically on the same spectrum, but their odds are nothing alike. The pattern shows that the more symptoms, the longer the history, especially of real physical withdrawal, then the worse the odds that moderate drinking can actually work for them. So back to Brad Pitt and Bradley Cooper. I can't tell you where either man falls, and neither can anyone else, because we don't have their entire medical records, and public interviews aren't diagnoses. An addiction specialist quoted in the coverage of the story made a point of saying exactly that she was raising a general caution to anyone hearing about Brad Pitt's story about testing the waters themselves. I think that's a responsible position. And here's another limitation. These are just population numbers. They tell you what happens across thousands of people. They cannot tell any individual which group they're in. No blood test, no scan can sort you in advance, which is exactly why this argument gets so ugly. And let me show you how ugly. Let's go back to the 1970s in California. Two researchers, Mark and Linda Sobel, ran a study at a state hospital. They took people with serious physically dependent alcoholism and tried to teach them controlled drinking. Not abstinence, but controlled moderate drinking. They reported that some of them managed it. Then, in 1976, a major national study, the RAND report, found something similar. A 4-year follow-up in 1980 said the same thing. The response was not a scientific debate, it was straight-up war. In July 1982, the journal Science published a paper by 3 researchers who tracked down the Sobel subjects and reported that most had failed almost immediately. One author went further and publicly accused the researchers of fraud, and it made national news. And the part that almost nobody knows, the Sobels were investigated by a congressional investigator, by a 5-member federal panel, by a Blue Ribbon Committee in Canada, and by the American Psychological Association's Ethics Committee. Every one of them cleared the Sobels' research. There was absolutely no fraud found. But the accusation traveled across the news media, and the exoneration didn't. So research into controlled drinking essentially froze for the entire next generation. For about 30 years, one of the most practically important questions in alcoholism research went understudied, not because it was settled science, but it was just so dangerous to touch. By the way, I'm not telling you this to pick a side, but I'm telling you this so that when someone answers this question with total confidence, you remember that actual confidence in this field has a checkered history. So where did the all or nothing rule come from in the first place? It's older than you'd think. On April 2nd, 1840, 6 drinking men in Baltimore went to a temperance lecture as a joke. They came back and made a pact to quit together. They called themselves the Washingtonians, and what made them feel different from every temperance group before them was the membership rule. You had to be a drunkard, a drinker helping another drinker. They met, told their stories out loud, and it spread like wildfire. Something like 600,000 pledges within 3 years. In 1842, a young lawyer named Abraham Lincoln gave a speech praising them, arguing that the reformed drunkard, not the moralist, was actually the most persuasive man in the room. That's mutual aid recovery roughly 95 years before Alcoholics Anonymous existed, which means the thing Brad Pitt described, men sitting in a room being honest with each other, is one of the oldest ideas in addiction recovery. And then it just collapsed almost completely. Historians point to a few reasons. They got dragged into political fights over prohibition laws, tangled up in religious controversy, their famous speakers relapsed publicly, and they had no structure once the emotional high wore off. Here's an interesting detail. When Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith later founded Alcoholics Anonymous in Akron, Ohio in 1935, they'd never heard of the Washingtonians. They learned about them later. And when AA wrote its 12 traditions, no outside affiliations, no opinions on public controversies, one single purpose, they were deliberately building a fence around the grave of the prior movement that had died from exactly those things. One more interesting thing about Bill Wilson, one of the AA founders, because it's astonishing and almost nobody mentions it. Wilson got sober in a New York hospital in 1934 during a treatment that included belladonna, a plant preparation known to cause hallucinations. During it, he saw a blinding white light and felt an overwhelming presence. He never drank again, and that experience became the spiritual center of AA. Now, people have argued intensely for 90 years about what it was. Was it a real awakening or a drug reaction? We can't resolve that. But there's an interesting footnote. In his later years, Wilson himself championed high-dose vitamin B3 for alcoholism, starting in 1956 when it was legal and being studied at major institutions. He took part in supervised LSD sessions, the drug commonly known as acid, with a research physician because he wondered whether it could reproduce the spiritual opening that he'd had in that hospital bed. So think about it. The founder of the world's most famous abstinence program spent his final decades trying other substances and hunting for a shortcut to the experience that saved him. What if the people who build these movements are often far less rigid than their followers? Now on to the health effects. Controlling alcohol perfectly does not make it safe, and after age 60, the same drink is doing something totally different to your body than it did at age 40. Start with cancer, where the evidence is about as strong as this field gets. Your body turns alcohol into a chemical called acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde damages DNA directly and is classified as a carcinogen. In January 2025, the US Surgeon General issued a formal advisory naming alcohol as the third leading preventable cause of cancer in America, after tobacco and obesity, linked to 7 cancers including breast, colon, liver, esophagus, mouth, throat, and voice box. The National Cancer Institute has estimated alcohol accounted for close to 100,000 American cancer cases in a single year. Especially for the women watching, breast cancer risk starts climbing even at very low amounts. Roughly 1 in 6 American breast cancer cases is attributed to alcohol. For decades, researchers asked, how much alcohol is good for me? And now the question people are asking is, how much risk am I willing to accept for something I enjoy? The answer is allowed to be different for different people. In 2025, 2 separate federal reviews looked at alcohol and death rates to inform the same national guidelines. The national academies concluded that moderate drinking was associated with lower overall death rates. A different interagency review concluded the opposite, that risk starts at even low levels of alcohol consumption, and there's no net benefit at any age. So think about that. 2 federal bodies, same question, opposite answers. The core of the fight is a flaw called abstainer bias. For decades, studies found that moderate drinkers tend to be healthier than non-drinkers. But look who's in that non-drinker group. Often includes people who stopped because they got sick. So compare drinkers to a group that's populated with recently ill, and then the drinking by itself looks protective. In 2023, an analysis pooling over 100 studies and nearly 5 million people found that after correcting for that bias, the apparent benefit of light drinking totally disappears. Of course, the alcohol industry publicly disputes that there's any settled scientific consensus here. And you should know they're saying it, and you should know why they'd want to say it. Back in 2018, there was even a $100 million trial designed to finally settle whether a daily drink prevents heart disease. About 2/3 of the funding, roughly $68 million, came from 5 alcohol companies. The officials had gone out and raised that money, and after journalists exposed it, the director shut the trial down, and an internal review found that industry contacts appeared to intentionally bias the study towards showing a benefit from alcohol. So think about that. The definitive study meant to prove a drink a day is good for you was paid for by the people selling the alcoholic drinks. Now, the part that's most specific to older adults. As we age, we carry less water in our bodies. Alcohol spreads through water, so with less of it, the same drink produces a higher concentration in your blood. Add a liver that clears it more slowly and a shift in the ratio of muscle to fat, and it all adds up. The drink didn't get stronger, but your body's ability to process it got weaker. Then layer on top of that medications, sedatives, sleep aids, painkillers, antidepressants, blood thinners, even acetaminophen. A large share of adults over age 65 take at least one medication that interacts badly with alcohol, and many are drinking on top of it without ever realizing or being warned. Add to that falls, a leading cause of injury, death in older adults, and add sleep, where alcohol plays its worst trick. It helps you fall asleep faster, then totally flattens the deep restorative stage of sleep and wakes you up at 3 o'clock in the morning. So the exact thing many older adults drink for, sleep, is a thing that it actually really destroys. And what I discussed earlier about Alzheimer's and alcohol. There's a condition called Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. It comes from a shortage of thiamine, vitamin B1, which heavy drinking both depletes and blocks your body from absorbing. It causes confusion, memory loss, trouble forming new memories, personality changes, and is routinely mistaken for Alzheimer's disease. Why that matters is that Alzheimer's right now we cannot reverse, but the acute phase of this condition is a medical emergency that does respond to thiamine, and treating it early can prevent permanent damage to the brain. I'm not telling you, by the way, that anyone's dementia is really this. Most dementia is not. But what I am saying is that if an older adult who drinks a lot develops sudden confusion, memory problems, unsteadiness on their feet, or strange eye movements, it's an emergency room situation, not just let's mention it at the next doctor's appointment. Ask directly about thiamine, because families that may have accepted it as a permanent diagnosis could end up finding some possibility of help and potential reversal if treated early. Now, America is quietly answering both questions about control and health simply by drinking less. But it's not the America you'd expect. The people cutting back are the young. In Gallup's 2025 survey, 24% of American adults said that they drink alcohol. That's the lowest in roughly 90 years of polling, below the old record from 1958. 44% of Americans now call themselves total abstainers. Among people who still drink, a record low 24% had a drink in the past day, and 40% said it had been more than a week. Average weekly consumption fell to 2.8 drinks, down from 3.8 a year earlier, lowest since 1996. And for the first time ever, a majority of Americans, 53%, said 1 or 2 drinks a day is bad for your health. In 2018, that was only 28%. Now, surprisingly, only 20 years ago, young adults were the most likely Americans to drink. That's what everyone assumes is permanent kind of culture, that young people drink. Well, it isn't. In the most recent Gallup data, adults under age 35 drink less than adults 35 and over, about 50% versus 56%. Young adults are now the most sober age group in America. That has never been true before. Gen Z hasn't gone completely sober. Industry data suggests around 3/4 of legal age Gen Z still drinks. They just drink roughly 20% less volume than millennials did at the same age. Not total abstinence, but restraint. So what changed? I think 4 big things, starting with brain chemistry. First, they figured out the morning after. There's a new word for it now, hangxiety. Somewhere between 12 and 22% of drinkers report real anxiety during a hangover. And here's what's happening in the brain. Think about your brain as having a brake pedal and a gas pedal. Alcohol pushes the brake pedal. It boosts a calming chemical called GABA and eases off the gas by dampening a stimulating chemical called glutamate. That's the relaxation people feel. But your brain hates being pushed around, so it overcompensates. And when the alcohol clears, the brake is worn out and the gas is floored. So people get a racing heart rate, restlessness, a sense of dread. It's a seesaw snapping back. The younger generation already shows high levels of anxiety. So they looked at this trade-off and just decided it wasn't really worth it. Second, the pandemic ran an experiment that nobody had really planned. A huge share of Gen Z turned 21 while the bars were just closed during COVID. So they never built that Friday night out habit. You can't break a routine that you never formed. Third, the money. Gallup found the steepest drops in drinking among lower income Americans. Under 40% of households below $40,000 of income now report drinking, down from 53% just 2 years ago. So some of this decline isn't a wellness choice, but it's due to rising costs of living. Fourth, they're not in the same room anymore. Time use research suggests that total time of in-person socializing fell from roughly 30 hours a month in 2003 to only about 10 hours a month in 2020. Alcohol was never just a solo drug in American life. It was often the social infrastructure, the thing people did while they were with other people. So take away the being with other people and instead replace it with being on your phone, and a lot of the associated drinking just goes away with it. You may also hear that marijuana has simply replaced alcohol. Gallup's own director of research says their data doesn't support that. Marijuana usage has been fairly steady for several years. The cultural shift is best captured in one line. Not drinking increasingly requires less explanation socially. Ordering a soda at a work dinner used to need a reason to justify it. Well, it doesn't really anymore. But everything I just told you that's true about younger people, it's not true about older people. Binge drinking among adults 65 and older rose from about 7% in 2006 to over 10% by 2017. Research in the journal Alcoholism, Clinical and Experimental Research found that among older women specifically, binge drinking climbed roughly 3-something% a year over an 18-year stretch, while holding flat among older men. Alcohol use disorder among older adults above 65 and up more than doubled across a 12-year window. And the mortality data is also quite surprising. CDC records show that alcohol-induced deaths peaked at over 54,000 in 2021, up from around 39,000 only a few years prior. Among adults 65 and up, the alcohol-induced death rate jumped more than 18% in a single year. So this is a complete reversal. Young Americans are now the most sober adults in the country, and older Americans are being more harmed by alcohol than at any other point in modern American history. It absolutely surprises me that nobody's making documentaries about this. It's happening to older adults in living rooms across America at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, often all alone. And notice how it connects to that time spent socializing number. If drinking was a thing you did while you were with people, what happens to the person whose people are gone? People who retired from their job, their friends have moved away, maybe their spouse passed away. The loneliness just sets in. And a quick historical footnote, because it's one of the best cautionary tales here in this field. Everybody knows from history that prohibition failed. But what is interesting is that the data is messier than either side will admit. Deaths from liver disease fell during prohibition. But economists who studied it closely found much of that decline started during World War I, before official national prohibition took effect. Their estimate is that prohibition itself cut cirrhosis by roughly 10 to 20%, not the 50% that was claimed. And drinking crept back up through the 1920s anyway. An even more surprising part, after repeal in 1933, American drinking didn't just snap back. Consumption per person stayed at less than half the pre-prohibition levels and took decades to recover. So the lesson here isn't that prohibition works or doesn't work. It's that a culture's drinking habits are often stranger and more unpredictable than any policy argument assumes. It's worth remembering while we watch the whole younger generation put the glass down on its own, with nobody passing a law at all. And the phrase that Brad Pitt used, off the wagon. It comes from the water wagon. 19th century temperance men said they'd sooner drink from the cart that sprayed water on dusty roads than take another whiskey. So Brad was quoting the Washingtonians era without probably even realizing it. So let's answer the question that I opened with. Can recovering alcoholics drink safely again? On control, some people genuinely do drink again without losing it, but they're overwhelmingly the people whose problem was the mildest to begin with. No one can tell you in advance which one you are. The federal government now recognizes that in its own definition of recovery, and it has not been studied robustly enough. On health, even moderation doesn't necessarily make alcohol safe, especially after age 60, less alcohol is preferred. On culture, the country is gradually walking away from alcohol, but the harm is now landing on older adults. Two ideas to leave you with, both from researchers who spend their careers on this. The first is from Dr. Alta DeRue at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. Even if someone drinks again, the sober years still count. The coping skills they built, the relationships they repaired, the physical healing that happened, none of that gets erased. Relapse is not a rewind button. It's not a permission to drink again, but it's mercy for people who relapse. The second is from Dr. Christopher Collar at Brown. Recovery confers no permanent status and has no finish line. What works for someone today may not be where they find themselves in 5 years. That applies to Brad Pitt. That applies to Bradley Cooper. It applies to the person you're thinking about right now, and maybe it even applies to you. Remember what Brad said was the thing that actually worked. A room full of men being honest in a way that he'd never heard before. Those 6 men in Baltimore in 1840 figured out the same thing. They didn't invent a treatment. What kept a man from the bottle wasn't hearing a lecture, but hearing from another man who'd been there, sitting across from him on a Tuesday night, being honest. I think for a lot of people, especially those over age 65, the drink at 5 o'clock isn't the problem itself. I think it's a substitute, because it fills in when the room around them empties out. So if you watch this and you thought of one specific person, please call them. Not to talk about their drinking, just call them and talk to them about their life or about anything. Then please send them this video, because the thiamine part alone is worth their time, and because many families never hear any of this until it's an emergency. I'm Neil K. Shah. Let's take care of each other, and thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.